This is Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer, a podcast where Tim and his friends engage in purposeful conversation about identity, parenting, culture, faith, and more. Tim Stauffer is a professor of counseling and a licensed clinical counselor. My name is Sam Mayung, and I'm Tim's friend. My life has been greatly enriched by my time talking to Tim and getting his thoughts on many matters that impact my life daily. After listening to this podcast, I hope you'll feel the same. Guideposts are discernment markers. They provide opportunities for direction as well as warnings of pitfalls. Go this way and be careful of that way. We hope that each episode provides some sense of direction as we navigate the challenges of daily life. Thanks so much for listening. Quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider. Good morning, Tim.
Hi, Sam.
Thanks for listening to us today. So we're going to continue our conversation about identity. Tim, I'll do a quick little recap. If you have not listened to part one of this conversation, you really should do so. Much of what we'll talk about won't make sense unless you've listened to that first episode. But Tim, I'll do a quick little recap of what you call the narrative loop.
Sounds good.
And this narrative loop is pretty essential as to determining, our sense of who we are. And it kind of goes like this. An event happens in your life. You use this example of being in middle school with a music teacher who pretty much just embarrassed you because you weren't singing in key, right?
Correct.
So you had this event, which then you started to create this narrative about yourself that no one wants to listen to you. And so those narratives start to then inform your emotions. Mm-hmm. And so in this case, feelings of unworthiness, unwantedness, you don't bring something to the table that other people want. Mm-hmm. And then those emotions then create new behaviors, and oftentimes these behaviors reinforce the initial event in a way that makes the narrative become even more real and even more deeply internal, and then thus you start finding yourself like you didn't just have a singular bad experience, it's now I am an unlistenable to person, right? And that's like who you are. And so this is what we started talking about last week, is how a lot of our identity gets formed is through these events and the narratives we start to create about them. Is that a fair summary?
That's a wonderful summary. Let me give a little bit more of the story that might explain more about how our behaviors will then create new events or have an effect that reinforce the narratives.
Yeah.
So my experience in middle school led me to say, people are never going to hear me sing. I won't open my mouth. And so when I went to high school, there was a requirement for every single student to be involved in the choir and the chorus.
Okay.
So this sets up a quandary.
Yeah.
It's a very small private school, only maybe 100 or a little over 100 students in the entire high school, so everybody knows everybody. And I'm a freshman in high school, and you have to be in choir. Well, guess what? I stood in choir, and I lip sank the entire year.
Okay.
On top of that, the girl that I liked stood right beside me in choir. So there's not a chance I'm going to open my mouth and sing and have myself heard. I'm not going to embarrass myself in that way. My resentment began to build. My sense of inadequacy. All of my behaviors began to reinforce this sense, or this deep sense, that it's best for me to keep my mouth shut or not to be heard. And I was so contrarian that I went to the high school administration and I lobbied, and surprisingly successfully, to not be in choir or chorus for the rest of my high school year.
Wow.
So from my sophomore year till I graduated, I was exempt from having to sing in the choir.
That's fascinating.
And so what am I doing? What's the behavior doing? It's isolating me. It's isolating myself.
Sure.
I'm isolating myself from my peers. I'm withdrawing. I'm pulling myself out of the community, and I'm stuck in the library by myself, being there while all 100 of my peers are in choir. One of the things that I don't ever recall anybody ever asking me is, Tim, why don't you want to be in choir? Like what's going on? No one seemed to, that I remember. I might not be remembering adequately. No one came and inquired about that or helped me process that. So my my emotional processes and my behavior began to express themselves in such a way that led to isolation and led to withdrawal and led to not being a part of the group. There's a yearbook picture in my high school yearbook that shows a picture of me sitting in the library looking philosophical. And my picture is in a music note. And the caption under the picture was, Tim, the one and only student not in chorus.
For real?
For real. I have the yearbook at my house.
Wow.
So here it's becoming instantiated and documented.
Was that a funny thing, or was that like a public shame thing?
I don't know. I don't know the motivation behind it, but what I do know is that the injury or that aspect of my sense of humiliation and my sense of I will not subject myself to that kind of, I just simply won't allow myself to have that happen to me again. And so that, my behavioral processes kind of swung right back around. Sure. And now I'm, in essence, I don't think anybody was being malicious.
Sure.
Much like I don't think my music teacher in middle school was being malicious.
Sure.
But the impact on me was significant. It's like now I'm being reinforced, and the outcomes of my behaviors are reinforcing this sense that, Tim, you're by yourself. You're not part of the mix, and it takes on strength. And what's dastardly about our narratives is what occurs with them is that we begin to orient our lives around those stories. And the orientation that we bring to the rest of life, like, it overblows the significance of the events themselves. And so I can begin to, like, hamstring myself or to keep myself from engaging in life in ways that I otherwise would be very qualified to do and have the potential and the gift sets. I might allow those narratives to hold me and keep me stuck in behavioral patterns that all they do is hurt me, and I can't figure out why. Because, like, how easy is it to connect a mean music teacher in 6th grade to my professional decisions down the road? Like, my impulse when you asked me about making this podcast, that narrative popped to life just like that. It was. I was like, I don't have, like, what do I have to offer? Who wants to listen to me?
Yeah.
Lots of evidence to the contrary, but there it was.
Yeah.
There's the narrative. And we have to, it's like, what is the way out of that behavioral trap, so that we can orient our lives around something different? And I would love for that to kind of be the center point of our conversation today, is like, how do we
break free from this narrative loop that'll just continue to feed itself? Right.
And so I'm curious, like, your thoughts as you've reflected. Last episode, I felt like I was monologuing a great deal as I was walking through that. What were some of your reflections? And say a little bit about what you were thinking and feeling as we talked that through.
I definitely, one of the big ones, and I was talking with Rachel, my wife, about, was one of the things that I continue to find, even when we struggle with conflict in our own marriage, one of the things I struggle with is this, this I want things to always be at peace, like no, disruption in particular to relationships. And so if there's relational strife or relational tension, like it just, my body can't handle it kind of thing. And so been processing for myself what is the root of that. And, so from very little, always viewed my role within our family as being like a peacekeeper kind of person, and misreading things that when there's disunity in relationships, that it's my fault. And now much of that is not actually accurate, but that's over time has continued to feed itself. And so when Rachel and I have a conflict and she says something, I immediately go, well, it was something I did or didn't do. Like, and she'll even say to me, like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't about you. This isn't about you doing something wrong or not doing something. Like, I am just expressing to you how I feel in the moment, but my immediate reaction is like, oh, I didn't do it right, or I didn't do enough, or something like that, And so that's been one that I'm realizing I have a narrative that I would like to break free from.
Sure.
So that's one of the probably like larger ones of the past week that I've been thinking about this.
Right. I think maybe we can talk a little bit about like what are the strategies that we have tried in breaking free that have been ineffective.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon for us to have some sense that, that storyline or that narrative or this way of thinking isn't particularly useful, or it's damaging, or I'm dysregulated by it, or it's causing depression or anxiety, or and so we try to break free. And oftentimes what people will do, and I think Christians at times do this a great deal, is they try to take particular Bible verses or statements of like the "Who am I in Christ" verses and quotes, and it's like they paste them on top of these deep narratives that we have, and then they just rehearse them consistently. And there's an element of that can be a helpful process, like of reminding ourselves about the truth. There's another problem though, is that it's a little bit like taking a sticky note or nailing into rotten wood. It's like we're trying to fasten something to something that doesn't have any strength underneath it. There's nothing of depth there. And so we're just pasting on, or we keep painting over top of the water stains, and they just keep burning through.
Or putting lipstick on a pig.
Right. And so it's like rather than go up on the roof and fix the leak, we'll spray it with Flex Seal, and we will use the best possible primer and stain killer, and we keep painting over it, and we keep puttying over the rotten wood, and it just doesn't work. Or it's like we touch up paint on the rust on our car, and it's like, unless you grind off the rust and prime it, it's going to keep burning through. And
Sure.
So many people experience these deep life narratives as they keep burning through. They keep encountering them, and they keep hurting a person over time. And so I don't think it's particularly effective to simply just paste over top. But that's what I would say many of or most of us do to try to deal with these things that wound us. I like to think that the way out has more to do with us addressing the deep traumas that we've experienced in life and accepting the reality that we were hurt and that we've been traumatized or that we've experienced something that kind of burned into our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think of it like a tree. If a tree is injured in it as a sapling, you can sometimes see this in really majestic trees where the trunk takes this kind of wicked bend and then it straightens itself out and it's growing back to the sun. And it's like when you see that in a tree, you know something happened to the tree in that particular space. And we can't go back and make that thing not be there.
Sure.
It's like we want to think through about how do we accept the realities of the narratives that have hurt us or the stories that have hurt us. And then we can begin to explore how are we going to orient our lives and interpret that event differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like the picture of the tree and then choosing, like, once accepting it, learning then how to grow, I like that picture a lot. I think another, you're talking ineffective strategies. And so there's this almost like real superficial way of like, well, I know I'm not a miserable person, and then you just paste something on very superficially. I think another one too is we try to we see the behaviors we're reinforcing aren't helpful or potentially detrimental to our life, but so then we just try and focus on just changing the behavior. And so then we're not even pasting on a new identity. We're just trying harder. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And it obviously just leads for a bigger letdown down the road, from my experience, at least.
Right. It's almost like it's inevitable that we're going to collide with it. It's like we can summon our strength and work really, really hard, but it's like it's going to be there waiting for us, and it's going to grab us when we're exhausted and tired and frustrated, and there it is again. And how many of us resonate with the reality that the things that have dogged us from adolescence, like if we look back at what did we really grapple with in late childhood and adolescence? There's probably a great deal of consistency between those things and the things that dog us as adults. It's like, okay, what's that about? Well, it's about the narrative structures. It's about the way we narrate story. And so many people don't like the idea of like rehashing the past or going back and looking at the past. And I don't either. It's like, I think in many regards, what we have to recognize is that the narratives in which we're telling ourselves today are not the past. It's like they're present. They're present narratives, but they have a history. And so we validate our experiences in life by validating that our present struggles or our present narrative struggles, the things that hurt us, the way we talk about ourselves, the way we deal with ourselves has a history and a context. And if we aren't willing to do and understand the context and look at the history, that would be like going to a doctor with a major infection and say, I'm not talking about what happened to me over the last 20 years because it has nothing to do with today. Fix the infection today. It's like, well, any reasonable doctor is going to say, I need to know how this happened. Like, what's the trajectory here?
The history that created this infection.
Right, because that's going to significantly inform how it gets treated. And so we want to courageously be willing to look at the narrative structures of our lives and say, can I find my way to orienting that myself to a different storyline or to a different interpretation of the story? And I believe that's the way out of those narrative stories. And I think as Christians, we can find this very clearly in the scripture. In especially Ephesians chapter 1 talks about this process that helps us tremendously. One is Ephesians says that Paul is writing, and he says that you were included in the family of God, and the inclusion isn't related to something that you did. It's that you have a sense of belonging, and you're part of the family of God. So it's like you're given an identity. It's like you're not finding something. It's like you're being gifted with something. And then Paul goes on and he prays for the Ephesian church and says, I pray that the Spirit would give you wisdom and revelation so that you might know God better. And it's like wisdom and revelation is a narrative process. It's like wisdom and revelation tells us something about who we are. It tells us something about God's perspective of us. And so when I think about my story in 6th grade with my music teacher, I developed a perspective, but that perspective diverges significantly from God's perspective. I interpret that in a way that's radically different. And so the question becomes is what will I begin, whose story will I orient my life around? And will I begin to orient myself around the stories that God tells me? What will I orient my life around a more accurate story? And if I'm willing to, I have to accept that I have an old narrative and it's resilient and it's powerful and it has been useful to me in some regard, but it's broken and it's a narrative that does not serve me well. And yet I keep returning back to it because it's so deep and it's so old and I have spent so much time orienting around it. And so my conviction is that I'm going to orient myself around a different story. And that's where we can begin to tap into like scriptures that tell us something different about ourselves. It's like when we can say, I'm not pasting this on top of, but I am orienting myself around this thing. And to orient ourselves around something different is to validate the story that we have been telling ourselves as being a broken story, but it comes from somewhere, and we can respect ourselves in the process of healing. It's like, okay, I get it. I understand why I have this reaction. I'm not going to beat myself up for it because I was hurt as a young boy. I was humiliated and hurt. And so it makes sense that people who are humiliated and hurt are going to develop ways of thinking about themselves that probably aren't completely accurate. And so I can be kind to myself and compassionate and say, that story exists, but I'm going to actively orient myself to a different story. I'm going to listen to a different story. And that's wisdom and revelation. Yeah. And so say what.
So,
what you're
okay.
thinking.
So something I'm kind of thinking is even, you're talking about people kind of struggling with like, why should we bring back like things from the past? But, actually even think about disciplines of like communion in the church, like in the symbol that it is is this active recalling of the past. Like, and as we reflect on Jesus's life and death, like through the bread and the cup, like we're remembering our own, past and our own involvement in the sin that required his death, but it also allows us the process of realizing his love and the gift that he gives us with being included into his family. So it's this active process of like no, it's a healthy thing to remember because and I think that's if you're actively engaged in that process, it's a really powerful experience to do that on a relatively consistent basis.
Right.
So that's, obviously that's a little bit more in the church and stuff like that, but
well, I think one of the dilemmas or one of the realities is that the people who say, let's not rehash the past, the problem is that they're actually being duplicitous or deceitful. What they're really saying is I don't want to look at how the past is my present because I'm scared of the story. I don't want to see in the present moment the way I'm like, I don't want to see these connections. But when the past really is the past and we have resolved it, then it does become like communion. Now I can say, this is the kind of person I was, but here, this is who I am today. And I'm not afraid of that. I'm not even afraid to talk about it because it's not the defining part of me. It's like I can have this conversation today about this narrative of feeling that people don't like me, but it doesn't have the punch it used to have.
Sure.
That is the past, but I have to be aware that part of my tree, so to speak, that there's a way of understanding the internal dialogue that I grapple with.
Yeah.
But it doesn't hamstring me anymore. It doesn't have to hurt in the same way, and I don't have to be scared of it. And if we're afraid to talk about our past, it's probably because it's probably really not the past. It's like it's continuing to live in our lives, and it needs to be processed so that we can get wisdom and revelation from God.
Yeah. That's good.
So what happens then after the next part of Ephesians in Paul's prayer? He goes on and he says that I pray that the eyes of your heart would be enlightened, so that you might know the hope that you have. And so when I think about that emotional spot that our narrative leads to how we feel and to the energy that propels our actions, that emotional energy or that emotive space is what I think Paul is writing about in the eyes of our hearts being enlightened. It's like when our eyes light up, it's because we feel something happening. The wisdom and revelation of God's perspective on us enlightens something inside of us. It opens up something. It gives us a hope for the future. It gives us a sense that there is a way out of the entanglements in which I find myself. And I can see with new eyes, and I can see that there might be a different way of being, a different way of living, a different way of approaching the things that hurt me. I now have something of substance, and it profoundly impacts the emotional and emotive space of what energizes us. And from that comes a whole different way of living. Now our behaviors can change.
Sure.
It's like, and the next part of Paul's prayer is that you will now live with the resurrected power of Christ. Your actions will now be informed by the power of the resurrection. New life. Old ways are dying and new things are coming to life. There's a way of being and a way of acting and a way of engaging the world that's radically different. It has resurrection power. It has new life built into it. And so you can think about it kind of like a formula of sorts. It's like God's perspective plus hope equals empowered living. Or we can think about it as God's narratives for our lives and our re-narration, how we tell the stories is going to impact our emotional world, and it's going to change the way we live. I'm going to have more courage. I'm going to take risks that I otherwise might not take. I'm going to live radically different. And then, well, what's the effect of that? Now we're going to start getting results in life that actually go against that core narrative.
Yeah.
It's like the new narrative will start being reinforced.
Yeah.
And so here's what I would say is process in life. It's like, this is a messy space. This isn't a switch that flips and all of a sudden it's different. It's like I think about it with my experiences in starting CrossFit a few months ago. It's like the longer I do it, the more I want to do it because I like the results that I'm seeing. I like the fat that I'm losing and the muscle that I'm gaining. I like the way I feel better. Oh, but some days who wants to get up and go? Like it's hard, it's painful, it's work. And then there's days you don't eat right and you don't go. And it's like, what's the effect that you get? It's like, ugh. So life is kind of that way. That's a really simplistic way of thinking about how the cause and effect of our own behavioral patterns.
Yeah.
But when we live with resurrection power, Paul goes on and writes, it's like in that space, Jesus is given his proper place in our lives. And that's where our identity becomes secure. It's like now my identity is getting more secure because Jesus is in his proper place. It's like my world is now being oriented around my identity in Christ. My world is being oriented around better narratives, deeper quality of narratives.
So this was why I think you're kind of starting to get to this. One of the questions I was going to ask you is why do you feel like God's perspective or his narrative is so important to this process? Like, why can't I just give myself a new narrative? Like, why can't I just be able to I'm just going to rewrite a narrative for myself and then allow that to change me? Does that question make sense?
Sure, it sure does. And I think there's an element of this process. This process works outside of the faith traditions. And in many regards, it fits right into what I would call classic mental health social science. We know that our thinking, our emotions, and our behavior all form together in a triad of sorts, and they all have effects. So if I'm struggling with anxiety, and I look at what are the automatic beliefs and the narratives or the deep beliefs that drive my anxiety, I can begin to challenge those beliefs. I'll feel better. My anxiety goes down. My behavior changes. And now I can engage life in a much more satisfying, less painful way. And I think that's a gift of common grace. There's a benefit to that. But if you think about it more in the theological or the more philosophical space, we are always still left with grappling with those deeper philosophical questions of who am I and why am I here? What's the purpose of everything? And it's I think God's perspective is as a Christian, that's the way I grapple with these deepest philosophical questions. And I think that Jesus tells the best stories about God and about how to live well in the world. That's my foundational valuing structure.
Yeah.
And so that's where people who don't, who may not share my perspectives on faith or around spirituality or around religious affiliation or around any of those kinds of things can still benefit from what I'm saying, because I think the gift of common grace, Jesus said, it rains on the just and the unjust. We all participate in this, the grace of God, whether we call it God or not. The process can still be helpful. And so there is a sense by all means, if you're not interested in a faith perspective,
sure,
I want people, regardless of faith, to suffer less. But you listen to any philosopher or any theologian, people will say life is suffering. You keep digging deeper into the philosophical questions of life, you'll get there. That's not a real, that's a pretty incontrovertible observation that has been made across time and across philosophies and across religions, is that life is suffering. There's a lot of suffering in life. There's a lot that is jacked up and broken. And the question becomes, how do we answer the questions, and what are the stories around that? And that's where I think you get down at the guts of faith and so forth. But if you don't want to talk about faith, you can move up a level and say, you know what, everybody can suffer less or have and I think there's something very noble, and Jesus even demonstrated there's something very noble about relieving suffering. Yeah. Even if it doesn't lead to what I would call deep spiritual transformation, or it's just to relieve suffering is a noble thing. Yeah. And it's a good thing. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
What you were asking?
Yeah, definitely. I think it does. And that's obviously going to be a individual choice and decision for each person to make. And I think one of the things, this is so compelling to me as to, God's perspective versus a narrative I create, is, wrestling with the reality of I am a finite being. I came into this world, and at some point I will leave it. That is the one thing that's guaranteed in my life. But if there is an infinite being, and what he has to say about me, that holds a lot of weight to me. If those things are true. And so more so than personally, as I, I've wrestled through this a little bit, as a finite being who creates finite narratives, but if there's an infinite being who creates an infinite narrative for me, I'm like, wow, that holds weight. Like,
sure.
and
That's
so
powerful.
And so that for me is, I think, where that becomes this illustration in particular, when we're talking about how do we break out of this narrative loop and create a healthier narrative, that just is compelling to me. And I think it really holds a lot of power into being able to change the narratives that we have been telling ourselves.
Right. So let me continue the story and tell you a bit about how this narrative began to change for me. So as I move through high school and I get out of school, one of my boyhood dreams, when I was 10 years old, was I wanted to sing and play guitar. And so not only did this music teacher humiliate me and embarrass me, it also stole a dream from me. And I struggled musically in terms of singing, but I'm able to hold a tune, and I'm able to sing a bit. And so at 19, 20 years old, I picked up a guitar and I said, I'm going to learn how to play. I started when I was 10, and I dropped out of lessons because I got jaded, and I just stopped and I quit. But at 20, I said, no, I'm going to pick up a guitar. And I picked up a guitar, and I had a friend teach me basic chords, and I got chord charts, and I began to start picking out songs on the 90s praise and worship music, which was very simple to play.
Yeah.
And I began to learn to play guitar and sing. And I began to open my mouth again. And I took a voice class in Bible college. And I began to start trying to find the courage to sing. And it began to work. No one laughed at me. Nobody humiliated me. In fact, one of my friends and colleagues was standing behind me one time, and he heard me singing, and he said to me afterwards, he goes, why do you always say that you're not able to sing? I just listened to you in this whole hymn sing, and that's not true.
Yeah.
And so part of how we begin to change is when we start to pay attention to the contradictions or the contradictory experiences that we have in life that tell us our narratives are false. And when we begin to pay attention to the contradictions, that the contradictory voices with those core narratives, we must start to pay attention to them and give them validity. And as we do, we will begin to change. And so this person said, Tim, why do you keep saying you can't sing? That's not true. Oh, okay. That's a shocking kind of water in your face kind of moment of like, oh, I'm lying to myself. I'm not. But that was just one thing. That didn't just change. That wasn't just all it took, but it began to crack the facade.
Sure.
I continued to play, and I continued to learn to sing. And one of my goals was that when I got married, I wanted to be able to sing a song in our wedding to my wife. And I practiced and I practiced and I practiced. And now there's a grainy old video where I have a guitar that my wife gave me for a wedding gift. And I sang to her on our wedding day. And I sang a solo with me and a guitar in front of 250 people at my wedding.
That's amazing.
And so it's like I'm beginning to adjust my behaviors. I'm saying, in essence, damn it. I'm going to press into this. But the narrative still exists. There's still an internal sense of people don't like me. They would rather I shut up. I don't have my voice isn't welcome, despite all the evidence to the contrary. I'm still experiencing this pressure, but I'm also actively saying no, that I will not orient my life around that narrative anymore. It's a broken narrative, and it hurt. I was hurt as a young boy, and I interpreted that the way I did. And I don't need to scold myself or shame myself for that. I just have to accept that's what happened to me. And I need to orient my life around a different kind of narrative.
Yeah.
So I started attending a church, and I was asked to be on the teaching team, and people loved when I would preach. I would get tons of good feedback from people. So I'm getting all this evidence that my ideas now are valuable to people. And so I decided to join the Christmas choir. And that was a huge step for me now to put myself into the choir space.
Yeah.
And so I'm at rehearsal and I'm singing and I'm enjoying it. And the director of the choir, while we were singing, looked over at me and turned and walked straight towards me. My blood literally ran like ice in my veins. I felt my whole body going tense.
Wow.
Because here came my music teacher.
Yeah.
And she walked straight towards me and stood right beside me while we were singing. And she reached out and she put her hand on my shoulder. And I froze. I was it was like here I am, a grown man, probably 37 years old, 38 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know it's like everything about that story is just like jumping back to life. I have spent all this time dealing with the narrative, and here it is, almost like in the kind of experience that injured me. And she moved on, and we kept on going, and she's a friend of mine. And
didn't say anything?
No, didn't say anything. I talked to her later and I told her the story. And she said, Tim, I thought about it. When I put my hand on your shoulder, she said, you were so stiff, like you were just frozen. And I said, yeah, I sure was. And here's why. And it's like, okay, these narratives are also in our bodies. It's like our physiology. These narratives impact the way we feel and the way our body responds to stimulation and to the environment. And so we have to, if we're going to break out of these narratives, we have to be willing to go back into them and into those kind of spaces and start watching for different outcomes and recognize that even if I was off key and even if she had to correct me, that wouldn't be a statement of like, it wouldn't have to be humiliating.
Yeah.
But it's not likely that we're going to get the same kind of outcome that we had. And so that became a moment of, oh, okay, I'm okay. I'm still welcomed here. I'm not told to lip sync.
Yeah.
I had people come to me, or a person come to me and say, oh, Tim, I love being close to you because I can hear your bass voice. I like that. I'm like, oh, that's, again, the narrative, another example of the narrative breaking.
Yeah.
Then I had a significant experience where it was like the things were chipping away, and all of a sudden the hammer hit the rock and the rock broke open a bit. I had started my clinical practice. I was deeply in debt from grad school. I wasn't hardly making any money, and I wasn't sure my practice was going to make it. I was like, man, I am really in bad shape. I've family of 5, and this is not working. And I think I'm going to have to find a different job. And I had a job possibility in a different state that would have paid a full-time wage. I was pretty sure we were going to move. And I was at the gym with a friend, and I was telling him about, I think we're going to have to move. And he looked at me and goes, Tim, I hope you don't move because I really like you. And for me, there was something in that moment where I'm like, oh, not only is my voice okay, I am now liked. Like I'm experiencing people saying, I like you. Well, here's another hit. It's another contradiction in the narratives. Yeah. And which one are they? It's like, how does God give us his wisdom and revelation? Often through people, often within spaces that have a risk to them. And God met me in that place and said, I have wisdom and revelation for you. and it broke something open for me. And so today, that narrative doesn't have near the clout that it used to, but I accept it's a part of my story, and I recognize that it's going to pop up its head periodically. And my job is to just recognize it, say, there it is. Okay. And then, orient my life around a different narrative.
Yeah. What do you do if, and I'm sure there's almost a scale on this, but what do you do when there is validity to a narrative? Like there is like truth, there is some truth like within the narrative itself. Does that make sense? It feels harder to rewrite a narrative if there are pieces of truth within it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So like say in your situation here, you're talking about, being told to be quiet because you were off key or whatever. But let's say you were, and clearly, like as the rest of your life has shown, like you can sing and you can do that. But what if you were genuinely tone deaf and you really couldn't hold a melody? Like how do you rewrite a narrative when there is a lot more truth baked into it rather than just a single event or a lie attached? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think that we tell the truth. It's like I'm not a great singer. Like I'm not a, like my boyhood dream of being like a country star or being a gospel music. Like I'm not. It's not that I'm this fantastic vocalist.
Sure.
And my rhythm is terrible. And so it's hard for me to play guitar with a group of people because I have a very hard time with rhythm. The dilemma is it's like, I can tell the truth about that, but that's not a self-deprecating process. So the narratives that hurt us are not the ones that are the truth. It's like the problem with narratives is like we can take something that's true, or we can take the truth and then we can interpret it as a lie. Like we can take the truth and say that means something about us that it doesn't mean. So if I'm not a good singer or I'm not a good musician, like I need to acknowledge the truth of that. And the truth of that will then lead me to say, this isn't the best place for me to try to live. Like if I'm trying to insist that I
put all your energy into that,
or if I should insist that I should be on the worship team or I should be able to join the band. Well, no, it's like but that doesn't mean you're diminished as a person or there's something wrong with you or that you are a problem person. And then it's like, but if that's the way we interpret the story, now we have a false narrative, or now we have a narrative that's the part that will injure us. The truth doesn't injure us. Sometimes the truth hurts. It's sometimes like it's hard sometimes to face like something that's true and accurate. And we wish that I wish that I was able to do X, Y, Z. Okay, fine. But that's not our gift set. And so, I'm not going to orient myself then to focusing on that which I don't have and the gifts I don't have, and then use that to say there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Because as soon as I do that, now I'm going to have the emotions of inadequacy and insignificance and depression and discouragement and worthlessness. It's like, well, that's a lie. Like that's a false narrative. That's not the perspective of God. But it might be true that I can't sing. There are people who they're not good singers and they can't sing on key. Like that's a reality. And the dilemma is that I was singing off key in 6th grade, and I wasn't performing to the standard that was desired. But the problem isn't that I was challenged in that. It was like the way the teacher went about it was wrong. It was developmentally, and he was out of bounds in how he dealt with it. But it's not that what he wanted was bad.
Sure.
And so, but I interpreted it that the way I interpreted about who I am as a person is the part that injures us. And so we embrace the truth, but then we wrestle with the proper interpretation.
Yeah. It has primarily to do with that interpretation piece is the thing that ends up
right
hurting us. Yeah. That's
right.
Good.
And that's what PTSD is oftentimes. It's like PTSD gets into our bodies. So our physical bodies will respond to stimuli. But in addition to that, we interpret things incorrectly. Like a person with PTSD is often interpreting current realities through the lens of the trauma. And so they will experience like, I'm not safe right now, when in fact, no, they are safe. It's just that their trauma is activated. And so PTSD treatment is often about, okay, I want to address my trauma. I want to walk through my traumas because I want to develop the courage to face them. There's more to me than what you know. Like there's more to me than I know. And so I'm going to courageously face the challenges of my life and the things that have hurt me. And I'm going to courageously step into that and see what happens. And I might still be afraid of it. Like even starting this podcast, there's a part of me, I'm like, I don't like, what if people I don't know. Well, I'm going to courageously face that. And if I find out that, you know what, it doesn't go that well, so what? It doesn't say anything about who I am as a person. It just means that was an idea and it didn't go as well as we thought and the way we hoped. And so we'll move on to another good idea. And it doesn't have to stick and see, you're an abysmal failure, or nobody likes you and wants you to shut up. See, you have evidence now. It's like, I'm not real concerned that that's going to be my interpretation. Yeah.
Even if this podcast fails.
Yeah. It's like, so what? It doesn't matter because that's not, I'm not orienting my life around that narrative anymore.
That's really good. That's really good. Okay. Well, what should so thinking about maybe kind of wrapping up our conversation for today. Thinking about someone who's starting to identify a narrative, and are there a couple like practical like things you should, I don't know, focus on if you're really wanting to be serious about seeing a new narrative become a part of your life? Like what would be like the first couple things you should really start focusing on, like practically?
Mm-hmm. I think like thinking back across the major life event stories that come up in your mind, like what are the one-liners that you find yourself saying to yourself or about other people that aren't serving you well, where it's like this isn't helping my marriage. This way of thinking is not doing me any favors at work. There's something broken here and I want to understand it. And so being honest about, these are the areas of life that seem to be negatively impacted. And here's where my thinking goes. Here's the kind of things I say to myself or about myself. That's one way of doing it. Another way is to kind of work backwards through the loop. It's like if let's say I'm feeling inadequate, I can kind of try to follow that emotional process backwards, back up to the narrative or back up to the way I'm thinking and saying, what's going on internally for me? Like what are the thoughts behind what I'm feeling? Like there's always a connection with our thinking and our belief systems and our narratives with what we feel. And so if I'm feeling inadequate or if I'm feeling sad or if I'm feeling angry, I can trace that like back and say, what's my experiences across time with this particular emotion? Like when have I felt angry before? Like, what are the kinds of things that really activate my anger? And what am I telling myself within those stories? And then I can begin to get a sense of what the narratives are through that emotion. And you can then, or if you don't start the emotional space, you can start the behavioral space and say, I'm doing this thing.
What, like, driving that.
I'm driving down the road and I flipped off the bird and I sped up and tried to cut them off and to make sure I teach them a lesson not to, well, okay, that you're feeling, I pull that back up. What's that? What are you feeling? Well, you're feeling disrespected. Oh, okay. You know what? I just have this deep narrative that people don't give a rip about me. And my presence in the world is not respected very well, or I'm not honored, or, oh, well, that's what happened in life that might have informed that story. And we can begin to understand, okay, what are the narrative systems so that that's part of what activates my anger or my sadness or my whatever behavioral stuff we might be doing that we say that's not helpful. Or if my wife says, hey, we need to have a conversation. I'm like, oh dear God, how about not? Like what about not doing that? Like, that sounds like a much better idea. You know what? There's a great new show. There's a good movie. There's a lot of things to do other than have a conversation. Well, that gives me, I can see now there's a behavioral pattern right there. I avoid. So if I'm avoiding something important, I wonder what that's about. That's hurting me. It's hurting my marriage. It's hurting my work performance. I can't do that if I want to thrive. I'm going to try to find, I want to understand this narrative structure better so that I can thrive and that I can experience life to the full. Those would be probably the way I would think about getting at what are those deep narratives. If someone has deep trauma in their life and abuse and neglect and like, then it's often we start with, it's like we know where some of the big hits have happened in our lives, and that's a good place to start. And that's often a time to seek out professional care of like, okay, I really need to deal with the traumas. For people who it's not clinical in nature, and doesn't require that level of help, then doing the internal processes on their own or within a small group community or with a group of friends, or just self-reflection and journaling can be helpful in kind of thinking those things through. But certainly if it's like in a place of severe symptoms and struggle, well, then seek out a competent therapist to help.
Great. Those are helpful.
But I think that's enough for today. That was a deep dig, and appreciate all of you who are listening. And thank you, Sam, for a great conversation.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. Enjoy the day.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Also, make sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to resources as well as an email address. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.